This House express its confidence in the National-led government and commend its program for 2011. As set out in the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament, Mr Speaker, 2011 is going to be a very important year for New Zealand. That's right. For one thing, Mr Speaker, it will be the year that New Zealand hosts Rugby World Cup 2011. 85,000 tourists from overseas enjoying the finest of New Zealand, 1,000 events from up and down the country, and of course the mighty All Blacks on display in home turf to win the Rugby World Cup in 2011. Mr Speaker, 2011 is also likely to be a year where the world is growing at a faster clip than it has for the last 3 years. It will be a year to cement in the structural changes that are so necessary for our economy, a year where we must continue to move from being a debt-fuelled, consumption-based economy to one where there is savings, investments and exports. Mr Speaker, 2011 will be a year where we must continue the rebuilding of the New Zealand economy, an economy that must be competitive. But maybe most of all, Mr Speaker, 2011 has to be a year where we don't write cheques that the New Zealand taxpayer cannot afford to cash. It's not a year for wild promises, Mr Speaker. It's a year for good, strong economics. There is no room for pixienomics in 2011, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, 2011 is also going to be an important year for the families of the 29 that lost their lives at Pike River Mine, a year where they deserve answers, where the Royal Commission will have good work to do. It's a year where we start in earnest the rebuilding of Canterbury after that devastating earthquake, and we start the work on the 175,000 claims that were a result of that earthquake. It is a year where we tackle some very long-term problems and some long-term issues, and where we turn around what has been a very expensive years of a Labor government. 2011 will be a year, Mr Speaker, where we continue to work hard for the hard-fought gains between Māori and Pākehā. It is a year where there needs to be hope and promise and aspiration. Mr Speaker, 2011 needs to be New Zealand's year. There are some very positive signs. The global economy is starting to look much stronger. We're seeing higher commodity prices. The Fonterra auction up 7% just last week. Lamb prices starting to rise. Wool prices starting to rise. Of course, the Rugby World Cup likely to have a bigger impact on the economy, and the stimulus impact from the earthquake. Mr Speaker, that may well be the case, but we also need to lock in the trends that we've seen in the last 2 years of a national government, because despite the fact that we inherited books that were a complete mess, despite the fact that we had to contend with the worst recession since the Great Depression, in the 2 years our government's been in, after-tax wages have risen 16%, while costs rose 6%. Mr Speaker, that's a 10% net gain in 2 years. I'm ashamed to even talk about Labor's record, which was a miserable 4% over 9 long years, Mr Speaker. So there are risks, of course, risks to the global economy, and we've seen that in recent weeks, risks that there is a great period of unsettledness in the Middle East. There are also risks, of course, in China. If there's an asset bubble. There are risks around the global capital markets, and we've seen that last year with Portugal and Greece and Spain and Ireland. There are risks that our exchange rate continues to rise against a very weak US economy, and there are risks, although you wouldn't know that they were there, from the opposition, from a rating agency like Standard & Poor's, who's put New Zealand on negative outlook. So it could be patchy, Mr Speaker, and there could be periods where it is one step forward and half a step back. But, Mr Speaker, overall, this economy has to change away from one of consumption and property, one to savings and exports. That's right. That's right. Mr Speaker, one of the first things the government will continue to work on is getting our books back in order. Over the last 5 years of a Labor government, spending increased by an average of $2.8 billion a year for every single year. My government has managed to pull that back to $1.1 billion a year for the last 2 years. In budget 2011, that is likely to be $800 million. The message is pretty simple. We are going to spend less and we are going to borrow less, and we are going to take the pressure off the Reserve Bank and off on New Zealand interest rates. And any political party who hasn't even got out of January by promising $5 billion worth of more expenditure that thinks they might be helping the New Zealand taxpayer is completely wrong. Mr. Speaker, we have to get our books back in order. We cannot afford the decade of deficits that we inherited from a Labor government. And one of the places we will be starting, Mr. Speaker, is in relation to the public service. New Zealanders deserve better value and better service. And we've started that work. In the 2 years that we have been in office, we've reduced full-time equivalent staff in the state sector by 5%. We've started the process of merging government departments, archives and national libraries into internal affairs, morphed and forced into one new Ministry of Science and Innovation. But we have a long way to go, Mr. Speaker. There are 80 Crown entities, all with their own boards, 38 government departments, 70 portfolios, 60 separate budget votes. We are, by international comparison, Mr. Speaker, bloated and inefficient. So there has to be change. We have put together a group of officials asking for advice on how we can streamline the public service, Mr. Speaker. And there will be core principles. The core principles are simple, that we need to ensure that in costing less, we ultimately deliver more to the taxpayers of New Zealand. So a big focus of attention will be around the state sector. The second thing we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is move towards greater savings and investment. We cannot, as a country, continue to have external liabilities that are at 85% of GDP. We cannot be in the same company as Portugal, Greece, Spain and Ireland, and if we are, we know what the picture looks like. We are prepared to be responsible economic managers. The Labor opposition, quite simply, is not. That's right. And so, for that reason, Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking at not only the operating budget but also the capital budget. Late last year, we recognised that the New Zealand taxpayers have around about $220 billion worth of assets. As a government, we want to acquire $33 billion worth of new assets over the next 5 years. We only have a number of options. One is to borrow more. That will not be acceptable to the rating agencies. The second option is to not build that infrastructure. That will not deliver us the jobs and the economy we want. The third option, Mr. Speaker, is to release some capital from assets that we already own. And so, Mr. Speaker, through the course of this year, we will be finalising our policy on mixed ownership models, where we will be looking to control 51% of Meridian, Mighty River, Genesis and Solid Energy. So, Mr. Speaker, let us understand those tests. The first is that the Crown will always, as a minimum, retain 51% control. The second thing is we will be asking the Treasury to provide for us advice about how we can ensure those Kiwi mums and dads are at the top of the list for buying any of the equity that we release. And that includes the 1.6 million KiwiSaver accounts. You see, the interesting thing is actually that we as a government want those 1.6 million KiwiSaver accounts and New Zealanders to be investing in our economy and our future, and Labor wants them investing in Australia. That's what they want. They don't want to let them invest in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, we will be ensuring that the Crown Financial Institutes, ACC, New Zealand Super Fund are investing in those kinds of assets along with iwi. So, Mr. Speaker, 2011, the budget will have a focus on savings and investment, and it will be taking on board the information that we've received from the Savings Working Group because, again, the message is very simple. We need to own more of our own future. We need to fund more of our own upside, and we need to have a stronger economy. And because the Labor benches can't add up, Mr Speaker, it's quite simple. When you own $220 billion worth of assets, you maybe release $8 to $10 billion worth of capital, and you buy another $33 billion worth of assets. You end up owning more assets over 5 years, not less, Mr Speaker, not less. Mr Speaker, the economy has to change to being a more export-led economy, because we have to get away from the position we inherited from Labor, which was quite simple. There was a world where we bought more from the rest of the world than we sold to them. That was a world where in 9 years they created no new jobs in the export sector. That was a period, it's not rubbish actually, that was the period where they spent so wildly that interest rates went up and the exchange rate went up. And maybe overall the way to test their commitment to exports is quite simple. Turn the clock back to 2007, the year of the exports under Labor. They did about 10 things, and you know what happened? Exports fell in 2007. And why did they fall, Mr Speaker? Because in the end, if you want an economy that's going to be competitive, you have to allow it the freedom to be competitive. You have to reform the RMA. You have to have flexible labour markets. You have to be prepared to build the infrastructure and invest in science and innovation. This year, we will be having a focus of attention on extending the free trade agreements that we've been working so hard on. Top of the list, of course, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an opportunity for New Zealand to have a free trade agreement with the United States. We will also be looking to make further progress on our FTA negotiations with Korea, and with an exciting opportunity that presents itself in Russia. The next area that we'll be spending and doing some more work is in infrastructure. This year we'll begin the rollout of the $1.5 billion government investment in broadband. Not just urban communities, Mr Speaker, but rural communities right across the country with ultra-fast broadband. We will be building more roads, Mr Speaker, including those 7 that we've prioritised as national significance, which will include Waterview, Mr Speaker. Excellent. The largest roading project actually undertaken in New Zealand. There will be more investment in public transport, in roads and in rail, particularly in Auckland and Wellington, and the rebuild of Kiwi Rail and their turnaround program will continue. In the end, Mr Speaker, though, the challenge, of course, for the government is to continue to build confidence in the business sector so that they will grow, they will invest and they will prosper. And maybe in the end, that's the single biggest difference between the national government and the Labor opposition. We trust the private sector to create jobs. We don't think the only place you should create jobs is in the core bureaucracy, Mr Speaker. We back New Zealanders to back themselves, to invest and employ other Kiwis. And we do all this for a reason. We build a strong economy so we can build better outcomes with better value for money and better services. One area where we will be undertaking significant work is around welfare reform. I say, Mr Speaker, you judge a society by how it looks after the sick and the vulnerable. But you also judge a society by how many sick and vulnerable people it creates. You see, Labor don't want to talk about their record when it comes to the sick and the vulnerable, because this is what they did in 9 years. Increased those on the sickness and invalids benefits by 50%. That's what they did. There was no mutual obligation where taxpayers agreed to look after others who are down on their luck. There was no attempt to take the 200,000 children who are currently trapped in welfare-based homes and give them a better future. It is a simple message from the national government, Mr Speaker. If you can work, you should work. But it doesn't mean that we'll necessarily cut costs in day one. We have to tackle those difficult issues of childcare, of increasing skills, of making sure those jobs are there. 2011 will also be a year where we'll focus on vulnerable children. There will be specific legislation changes to support children who are in state care, legislation that will protect children from abuse, there will be tougher penalties for those who fail to protect children at risk, particularly those who face